We want to invite folks to introduce themselves in the chat. It's always really exciting to see who makes it to these events. And for this conversation, we're particularly interested in hearing what kind of discipline or practice you come from. So maybe you're a dancer, maybe you're a sociologist, maybe you're a cultural worker. If folks wouldn't mind introducing themselves in the chat and sharing that information, I think it would be a nice way to get to see and know each other a little bit. Yay, Leslie, I'm always glad to see fellow anthropologists here. Oh, hi, Jason, we know you, a lawyer. I'm a cultural anthropologist and also an oral historian. Oh my gosh, people who are not cultural anthropologists need to weigh in. An archivist. Well, this is so neat. Thank you, guys. I'm going to go ahead and get started while this rolls along in the chat. My name is Amy Starczewski, and I direct the Oral History Master of Arts program here at Columbia. Tonight's event is part of our year-long Thursday evening public programming series exploring methodological experiments in the field of oral history. And part of the reason for that is that we've learned to understand that the field of oral history is often really narrowly identified with a certain kind of sit-down, one-on-one life history interview that's transcribed and goes into an archive. And in our program, we've been having a lot of fun, a lot of interesting conversations, trying to think more broadly about what oral history is and how we do it. That work is inspired deeply by the work of Indigenous oral historians like Nebia Mahuika, whose oral history and tradition is really changing the way that we think. And so tonight's event is the second in the series, and we're going to be hearing about using AI tools for analyzing and for managing oral histories. I want to introduce Chris Pandza, who's our speaker. His oral history work focuses on using a variety of artificial intelligence tools to analyze, organize, and sometimes generate oral histories. So that's sort of going to be a bonus aspect of tonight's talk and some of my favorite work of Chris's. While he was a student, he produced Nobody's Diary, which is a chatbot trained to emulate his daily audio diaries. His thesis project won a Jeffrey H. Brodsky Oral History Award for methodological innovation this year, and that's an award that we give to the most exceptional thesis projects in a given year. And you'll hear about that work tonight. He graduated from OMA in 2023 and now manages design at Insight, which is the interdisciplinary social science and humanities research center where OMA is based. His research interests include immigration, environmental justice, aging, and memory. So please join me in welcoming Chris. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over.
Thank you, Amy. And hi, everyone. What a turnout. This is amazing. Thank you for joining me tonight. We're going to talk, as Amy mentioned tonight, about using AI to do a few things to generate, analyze, and curate oral history. So I'm going to show you some use cases from each category, a live demo, and then we'll just have a discussion about what the implications are for oral history at large and also your own work, if I can help out in that way. So before we really dive in, I just want to level set on a few terms. We're going to start with AI. So AI is simply machines or computer systems that can perform tasks that typically require human intelligence, such as recognizing objects, learning, and most relevant to our conversation, processing natural language. The next definition flows pretty naturally out of that, which is natural language processing, which is the field of AI that deals with understanding, interpreting, and generating human language. And when I say natural language, it's just like the language that I'm speaking right now, human language. It's typically unstructured or semi-structured, and natural language processing is also often referred to as NLP. So we have AI and NLP. You're already familiar with NLP, even if you don't call it that. So NLP powers a ton of the things that you use in your day-to-day, whether you like it or not. It powers your voice assistants, translators, spell checkers that maybe get you out of trouble or put you into trouble, depending on your relationship with those. Also, the spam filters that help you sort through your email and get rid of all the junk, content recommendation engines, and in 2023, a lot of you may have heard about or even experimented with large language models like ChatGPT. So we're going to talk mostly about practical applications, but I think in order to understand my work and why I'm doing what I'm doing, we should probably start with some impractical applications. So in 2020, my life changed in a million ways, but in a really positive way, I discovered something called language models. And language models, you can think almost of like brains. They're these machines that we've fed millions of examples of human language. So books, interviews, essays, internet language. And from those examples, language models learn how to do a bunch of things with language. They learn how to read, interpret, and even generate language. And it's not too different from how you and I acquire words all the time. You might hear a term and you hear it in a bunch of different contexts, and suddenly, after hearing it a bunch of times, it clicks and you understand what the word means. So language models aren't too different from how you or I learn language. But what was most interesting to me is that you can train language models with your own examples. So you can take a language model that already has a baseline understanding of English or whatever language it's trained on and ask it to do additional tasks. So I had the opportunity to realize a lifelong dream, which is write a follow-up to Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette. And basically, I, with the help of my younger sister, started feeding a language model called GPT-2 sample Alanis Morissette albums. And I tasked it with writing new songs. And it did. It wrote songs like Your Grandpa's Best Friend, which goes, hey, I'll be your mommy. Hey, I'll be your dad. Hey, I'll be your guardian. I'll be your twin sister, your grandpa's best friend. And I laughed at first, but there's actually something really interesting happening here, which is, to me, this is the style of Alanis Morissette. You have the repetition, you have the listing of identities or things that are somehow conflicting. You can't really be somebody's grandpa and somebody's grandpa's best friend at the same time. And I became really interested in how the uncanny can help us understand the stylistic material of something. So what actually makes Alanis Morissette Alanis Morissette? And I kind of went on and just made a bunch of different kind of musical acts. But I turned the attention inward. So in 2022, when I was a student in the Oral History Master of Arts program at Columbia, I started to think more seriously about what the uncanny could be used for and what AI could be used for when thinking about personal accounts and oral histories. So my main question was, could I train a language model to learn to think like me? So these language models, they've been trained on all of these examples, and they can understand language, and they kind of have this social understanding of language. It's based on averages from across these huge collections. And I wondered if I could give it a little bit of information about me to get it to actually think and generate like I would. So I did a few things. Every day for about a year, I dictated diary entries into my phone. I took those recordings and I transcribed them with a product called Otter. I took a model called GPT-3, which is a predecessor to the Alanis Morissette model that I was using, and I showed it examples of my diaries, and I asked it to basically learn how I write diaries so that it could create a new model, which I affectionately called Chris 2.0, that could think like me, essentially. I also gave it a voice. I used a product called Resemble to record my own voice and make a synthetic voice. I added it to Chris 2.0, and I ended up with a machine that could generate new diary entries for days that had never existed, and also have some conversations in real time. So here's an example of what Chris 2.0 could generate. One of these diary entries is real, one is fake. It's been a year since I had looked at this, so I actually had to go to my database to remember which one was real, because it really got me. and it could capture my style and put me in situations that had never happened, but captured my responses. So the one on the left, which is about a nightmare that I had about my teeth and then me going to go get a bagel, that's fake. That never happened. And on the right, I'm reflecting on my need to like disassemble sandwiches like a squirrel and some of the shame that I have about that. I sent these to my mom, and I asked her if she could get a sense of me from these fake diary entries, and she said yes. I think someone could actually get a good sense of you from looking at these. She wasn't able to determine which were real and which were fake, which either means that the model's really good or we don't have a great relationship. I'll leave that to everyone else to decide. So just so you can hear what this sounds like, I'm going to play you just about a minute of interaction with Chris 2.0. This is me interviewing my clone. All right, it is April 2022. I am sitting in my apartment in New York City, which is why you may hear the odd, unusual noise. And I'm here with Chris 2.0. I'm by myself, but I'm with him in a way. He's in my computer. But I'm going to treat him like a person. So I'm going to welcome him into the interview. Hello, Chris. How are you doing today? Where are you right now? I'm on the subway. I'm on the downtown D train heading downtown. And where exactly are you heading right now? I'm not really sure where I'm going. I'm basically just riding the subway, enjoying the empty car, enjoying the skyline view right now. I guess you could say I'm kind of meditating, but not really because I'm thinking through a lot of things. I understand. I do that a lot, actually. Is now still a good time for you, or should we reschedule? Yeah, it is. It's a great time. I mean, this is exactly what I needed today. You said that you're thinking a lot of things today. What are you thinking about? Today, I was just thinking about the future a lot, and what I want that to look like, where I want to be in the next year, 5 years, 10 years. What goals I should set for myself that are realistic, what things I need to do to accomplish that. How I'm going to keep my focus in check. Wow, that's you sound really organized. I mean, I daydream a lot about the future, but I don't plan for more than a year at a time. So maybe you can help me. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? 5 years from now, I'm a researcher at Columbia. Lindsay Lohan is the president. I'm a professor sometimes. Okay. I sometimes have a girlfriend. I don't want a wife, but I have a girlfriend who I live with, and I live alone, but sometimes she stays with me, so I'm kind of living with a girlfriend. I don't really remember what else is going to happen, but I think that's all. That's all I've got for you. Yeah, maybe a couple of years from now I will be having a conversation with someone else and they'll be like, how do you feel about everything? I'll say, I feel really happy. Work is good. I just moved to a new apartment. I'm in love. My closest friends are here. And everything feels good. And then I'll cry. I didn't realize you were straight. I didn't realize you were a human being. It's just... That's all I can tolerate before I combust. But the through this work, I started to get a really good sense for what language models were good at and where they had some shortcomings. And throughout this whole time, I was really curious about applying language models to oral history work, but I wasn't really sure if it was appropriate because there's kind of this sentiment in the ether that AI is scary in some ways, and you can easily cross lines. So I felt really comfortable putting my own kind of words on the line. And through it, I mean, I was able to ask a lot of interesting questions, which is, how does co-creation work when there's only one person recording an interview? And I found that once I decided that I was going to feed my conversations to AI, I started thinking about what the AI might want to know about me. So in a way, there's always kind of some imaginary audience that's mediating the way that I talk about myself, even when it's just kind of in the comfort of my own home. So anyway, not to go too much into that, if you're really interested in this work, you can check it out at nobodiesdiary.ca. You can see how good you are at detecting fake diary entries, and I also have a talk up on there. But what I walked away with was an understanding that NLP tools can actually be really great for helping us make sense of human language, which is messy. And I can't really imagine anything messier than my diary, which has false starts and rumination, except maybe oral history. Oral history has some really, really messy language. And this is actually a really great thing. It's part of what makes oral history so powerful. The storytelling in an oral history interview is not following rigid guidelines. It's following the idiosyncrasies of somebody's memory and storytelling. You get these documents that become useful in a bunch of different fields, in psychology and social science to historians. But at the same time, you can create some really, really big challenges for secondary users of oral history. So if you're sitting at the table recording an oral history with grandma, she's speaking at 150 words per minute. After about 90 minutes, you have a small novella once you transcribe the interview. And if you do a follow-up session with her and another follow-up and maybe interview your grandfather or some other relatives, suddenly you have about 250,000 words. And unlike novels, that'd be about 5 novels. Unlike novels, you don't have any chapters, you don't have any headings, there's no index. And so if you want future generations or a researcher or even yourself to locate things, you can actually have a pretty difficult time finding information. And this has been a challenge specifically for researchers. So on the left here, I have a paper from Lucy Kucherova, who's studying Studs Terkel's work. And Studs Terkel is an oral historian and radio host who had this essay writing style where he would take interviews and really aggressively rearrange them. And Lucy Kucherova is trying to understand what editing decisions Terkel is actually making. So she does this really beautiful in-depth analysis of 4 interviews from an anthology called Hard Times, which is an oral history of the Great Depression, does these painstaking analyses and is only really able to cover 2.5% of hard times. So it's hard to make generalizations about the editing. Similarly, there's a researcher named Mario Verricchio from the University of Edinburgh who's studying the Ellis Island Oral History Project. And he makes it through 30 interviews, and he's trying to understand how the interviewers in this collection are constructing specific narratives related to the American dream and other kind of national myths. And 30 interviews is quite a few to comb through and kind of track the narrative trajectory of. And it's only 1.5% of the Ellis Island Oral History Collection. And so Verricchio's work and many other of these really promising analyses usually end with this conclusion that, there's something here, but we can't really know because we've only looked at a really small sample. A more systematic analysis is required. Many disciplines deal with similar problems using artificial intelligence. So in the business world and in the social science world, even in the humanities, you might hear the phrase digital humanities thrown around. And in the fine arts, people are using artificial intelligence to perform a bunch of tasks. They're looking at sets of documents and clustering documents that are similar. They're summarizing long documents into smaller documents to create metadata. They're looking at the topics that appear in documents and analyzing how those topics evolve over time or how they evolve depending on the speaker. They're even measuring sentiment. So this is a popular thing to do with tweets, where you look at what the feelings are behind somebody's tweets and how maybe those map onto, political affiliation or other things. But we don't do that in oral history. In oral history, for the most part, we're a little bit skeptical of these tools, and for good reason. So I'm kind of referencing here Anna Scheftel and Stacy Zabersky's work on slow work. So there's a really nice article called Slowing Down to Listen in Digital Age that reflects on some of the challenges that oral historians have when adopting information technologies like indexing or the web, because they can be at odds if they're not used carefully with how we like to do work. Because as oral historians, to produce these amazing documents, or even just to produce the interview moment that creates all these products, we're building relationships, we're listening deeply, we're analyzing carefully, we're sitting with entire interviews. And these things take time. You can't rush through them. It's something that separates oral history from other forms that on the surface level could look really similar, but their products are immeasurably different, and actually maybe measurably different. We'll see here. So AI can feel at odds with what we're doing as oral historians, but my work is asking, can we make this work for us? And is it inherent that these things can't be adopted into the discipline. So in order to actually approach these questions, I think there are three things we have to consider. First is what's available, what tools are out there, and how do they work? The second is, how do these tools create value for oral historians, and what are their limitations? And the third is, how do these tools interact with oral histories, epistemological, and ethical frameworks? And so I'm going to focus today on showing you examples that help highlight the first two. And I'd invite you to think about the third, and we'll have a discussion later that might help illuminate this and put it all together. And I'm going to use a specific use case, which is my thesis work from the Oral History Master of Arts program. My thesis was on the Ellis Island Oral History Project. For those not in the US, Ellis Island was a major immigration facility that operated from the late 19th century to mid-20th century. Millions of immigrants to the United States were processed through Ellis Island. There are also many people detained there. And the site now is controlled by the National Park Service, which also produced an oral history from 1973 to 2009 with over 2,000 people whose lives intersected with Ellis Island in some way. So mostly those are immigrants, but also their interviews with staff, descendants, and other people whose lives touched Ellis Island. And this oral history project is not really one continuous project, but a bunch of different series of interviews. So they're all trying to study immigrants who passed through Ellis Island, but doing it in slightly different ways. So the major distinction that there is, and this is a distinction that I found in an internal document from the National Park Service, is that before 1990, most of the interviews were focused on really addressing immigrants as immigrants and getting to understand their stories specifically as they pertain to Ellis Island, the voyage leading up to it, the actual experience being on Ellis Island, and then some information about settling in the United States. Post-1990, there's this shift, and there's the Ellis Island series, which introduces a questionnaire that has questions that go beyond just the immigration experience. It asks about life in the old country before moving to America, push and pull factors to move to America, and then once somebody has settled in the United States, how their life has progressed. This coincides with a larger shift from the 1970s onward in a bunch of disciplines toward more narrative approaches and more kind of life history approaches to the interview. And also another thing that's happening at this time is that between the 70s and the 1990s, tape capacities and the ability to produce longer interviews have expanded. So there's more leeway here, and there's just kind of an overall disciplinary shift happening. I want to focus on the two largest series from each camp. So on the left, we have the Keck series. Keck is the name of a consulting firm that was hired between 85 and 86 to do 200 interviews with the express purpose of producing quotes for the Ellis Island Immigration Museum. So if you visited that museum and you've seen some of the stories that are put up that are furnishing plaques and things like that, that's from this series from the 80s. And this follows an immigration-only format. So the interviewers really are trying to get sound bites for the museum about Ellis Island and about the Statue of Liberty in some capacities. And on the right, we have the Ellis Island series, which is 1,400 interviews. And it again used this questionnaire to capture more information about the narrator's life outside of Ellis Island, following what you would call a life history format. And this is kind of an interesting situation because you have the same object of study, the same institution, but different people and different project designs. And so I became really curious about how these project design decisions and project mandates could actually influence the content of the interviews. So I had two main questions. The first is, considering the topics discussed in this collection, is this distinction that the National Park Service makes actually meaningful? Are these interviews very different? And when I did a cursory glance and I read some interviews, I couldn't really tell if there was a meaningful difference. So that's something that I wanted to be able to measure. The second was, if there are distinctions between the immigration experience only interviews and the life narrative interviews, what's actually driving those distinctions? So in oral history, we have a nice understanding of all the complex factors that shape an interview agenda. There's co-creation happening between the interviewer, and also the narrator, but then they're speaking in terms of social structure and in terms of a culture. Things like the setting that an interview occurs in can have an influence on the interview agenda. So there are all these factors at play. But I want to know if I could start to unpack what factors are actually driving changes in the interview agenda and how they might relate to project design. So I asked the National Park Service for access to the collection, and they were very generous. They sent me a zip drive with absolutely everything I could need, except for one thing, which was a metadata sheet. And a metadata sheet is basically just a spreadsheet that lists all the interviews, who was interviewed, and some other basic information, who the interviewer was, how long the interview was, maybe the country of origin you would expect for these interviews. And without that sheet, it becomes really hard to ask and answer basic questions. So let's say you're interested in immigrants from France. How do you know which interviews in this list are from France? Maybe you make some guesses about surnames. You could be completely wrong there. Really, what you'd have to do is open up every interview and skim and try to find which interviews are relevant. And with 2,000 interviews, that becomes very, very impractical. So this leads us to our first use case for using artificial intelligence in oral history, which is using it to create some new information using oral history interviews, in this case, metadata. Not all hope is lost. When you open the interviews, they have this nice metadata header. And this header has a code that represents the internal classification of the interview, what series it's part of, and what number it is, the narrator's name, their birth date, and a bunch of other information. This information is actually stored pretty consistently, even though the project was conducted over many decades, which is great. But it's just inconsistent enough that some of the practices you would normally use to extract this information break very easily. So the most basic thing you could do is open up every interview and record the information manually. If it takes you 5 minutes to do that, over the course of the whole collection, working at 40 hours a week, it would take you over a month. And I'm a team of one, so that's not really possible. So the next approach you might use is some kind of pattern recognition approach where you look for specific elements in the text, like birth date, for instance, and you capture what follows afterward. So that would be great if birth date was spelled and formatted consistently across the collection. So sometimes birth date is 2 words, like it is here. Sometimes it's 1 word. Sometimes there's a typo and it's birth date. Sometimes it's date of birth. Sometimes the date is formatted just in numbers. Sometimes it's spelled out in abbreviations. And so it's a real nightmare to try to create any clear logic on how to capture these things. And even if you can, it's not going to capture most of the collection. So I remembered my handy model that I previously used to create Alanis Morissette songs and clone myself. And I figured if it can do those things, it can probably read this header and learn some things about the metadata there and store it in a format that's clean and clear for me. And in addition, because it can do some interpretation, I figured it could also do another few things, which is determine if the person being interviewed is an immigrant and also their sex or gender. And these classifications are interesting because you can infer them as a human. There's no field in these headers that says this person's an immigrant, but you can see some clues. This person, for instance, Elda, came from Italy in 1916. She was 5 years old, and we even know what kind of ships she took. So here's what I did. I sampled 100 interviews. I opened them up and I recorded them exactly as I would want the metadata. Then I fed those examples to GPT-3, which is a language model, and I tasked it with learning how I did the work I did and applying it to the entire corpus, which is just NLP slang for collection. So I fed the entire corpus to the model and asked it to produce metadata. And here's what it gave me: 20 plus columns of metadata for 2,000 interviews. So for the first time, I was actually able to calculate some basic stats about the collection. Who's in here? How old are they? When were they born? What countries are they from? And you might be thinking, okay, so what? I don't know how to code, so this is functionally useless for my project. The good news is that since I did this work, a lot has changed, and you actually don't really need to know any coding. I'm going to show you something. I hope you can see now my Chrome browser, and I don't have anything embarrassing open, but I'm going to show you this file, EI92 Rosenberg C.doc. I am going to get a model to extract some metadata and maybe extend the work a little bit and do some other interesting tasks. So what I have open right now is a product from OpenAI, which is a tech firm that makes language models, called the Playground. And the Playground is an interface where you can play with language models, and you can play with them using plain language, meaning you don't have to know how to code. You can give it instructions just in plain English or whatever language you're most comfortable working in. So here's what I want to do. I'm telling it, this is the first page of an interview. Extract the metadata from this interview, then write a summary describing the contents, then write a brief interview index. And to help it along, I give it a couple examples. So I've given it a fictitious interview with myself. And I've also given it a real interview. These two examples should be enough for it to do what I needed to do. So I'm going to take, you might not be able to see this, but I'm copying an interview, C92. Here's the interview, okay? I have my instructions, I have my interview, I'm gonna hit submit. There we go. So let's see, does this make sense? We know this person now is named Clara San Rosenberg. They were born in 1912. They're from Poland. The interview is 49 minutes long. What does she talk about? She discusses her early life in Poland, the journey to the US. She discusses some challenges faced as an immigrant, some cultural differences. And also, if we want some more detail, we can look at the index. We know that she lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That's interesting. There are probably many other people in this collection with the same profile, her education and career. So suddenly, we know a lot about this collection, and this is very easy to do. These tools, when I was working with them, you needed special permission to access, and now they are consumer facing. So here's from an earlier poll. I mean, this is the same kind of information. It usually takes between 5 and 10 seconds to do this. But stopping for a second, it's easy to think, wow, this is magic, because it does feel a bit like magic. But I just want to reflect for a second on what's happening here and how it could be useful for you and maybe where we should be wary. The first benefit, I think, is resource saving and reallocation. I mean, for the oral historians in the room, we're not working with huge budgets, and we have to be really intentional about how we're spending money. And if you have access to a research assistant or you're budgeting your own time, spending a month pulling metadata is maybe not the highest value add you can provide the project. Metadata, I think, is crucial for making a collection accessible to the public and accessible to researchers. But if you had that time back, what are all the other things you could be doing? You could be generating captions, you could be generating translations, you could be making your work more accessible, you could be having public programming, you could be compensating your narrators. So the resource savings are real. The limitations, though, the best language models, at least at the time of this presentation, don't operate specifically on your computer. So the interview has to leave the computer and it's processed offsite somewhere in the cloud. For some projects, that might mean that this kind of approach is inappropriate, either because interviews aren't ready to go public or because you haven't agreed with your narrator to process the interview in this way. So I have had a few situations where using GPT would make life so much easier for some basic tasks, but because of security concerns or because of narrator agreements, I haven't been able to use that. So it's one thing to consider. The second is low interpretability, meaning GPT is really good at doing things and actually really bad at telling you how it got there. So if you're planning to do any kind of meaningful analysis, you may have a better time using some kind of more rudimentary statistical models, which we'll get into, versus using a language model, because you can't really reverse engineer what you've done in an easy way. The third is that these models carry the bias of the data they were trained on. And so if you're working with a population that's not well represented, and the way they speak is not well represented by these language models, you could run into some trouble with the language model actually classifying language correctly. I mean, at Insight, where I work, we're doing a large-scale oral history project now with elders across America whose stories are underaccounted for. And so some of the language that's used in those interviews might not actually be parsable through these tools. And I mean, there are the sillier examples with the Chris 2.0 bot, which is powered by a language model. We see where it's actually making some good assumptions. It assumes that maybe in the future I want a wife, but even though it's the most probable, it's actually not correct. So we're going to move into another tool, which is called LDA topic modeling. And if language models are the bleeding edge, LDA topic models are kind of dinosaurs. They're tried and true. I think they're over 20 years old this year, and they came actually out of Columbia, where I am right now. And LDA models, if you're really interested in the technical breakdown, there's plenty of good documentation online, but I'm going to give you just a really high-level overview of what's happening here. LDA topic models are tools that you use to understand the topics being discussed in a collection of documents and how much of each topic is present in each document. And it works this way. So starting from the left, you have all of your documents. In my case, these are oral history interviews, and you have a number of topics. So you're telling the model how many topics to look for. It could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 1,000. The number of topics is more of an art than a science. But generally, when you provide more topics, you're going to get more granular results. And if you provide fewer topics, you're going to get more high-level results. Then basically, the topic model does a bunch of things, but it starts by looking at all of your documents and every single term that's mentioned in the document. So every single, usually the unit would be word. So every single word in the documents, every document, it has this gigantic matrix, and it counts. It counts the prevalence of words in each document. And then from there, it starts an iterative process where it tries to group things and tries to make sense of how these words co-occur in documents to generate topics. So it outputs two things. One is a list of topics, and the second is a breakdown per document, how prevalent each topic is. But let's make it real with an example. What are topics? Topics are just lists of words. So I've written a little dummy text about tourism in New York City. So a topic model might look at this document and notice clusters of words. So the first topic that it pulls out Brooklyn, Brooklyn Bridge, Coney Island, Prospect Park. It's probably talking about Brooklyn. The second topic is talking about the Chrysler Building, Empire State, Statue of Liberty. This is reasonably about Manhattan. So let's say I take every travel guide that's ever been written on New York City, and I ask it to look for 5 topics. It might produce a model that has these topics: Manhattan, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, just the basically corresponding with the boroughs. And if I were to take that model, which now is able to identify the proportion of topics in each document, different travel guides might yield different results. So if I'm looking at the restaurant guide, maybe you have equal distribution between Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and then the balance follows population. Maybe this is open to argument. You can argue in the chat if you'd like. The parks guide, I live in Manhattan. There's not much to say about our green space. Maybe that section is going to be a little bit smaller. The Art Deco skyscraper guide, though, might be completely about Manhattan. So this is kind of generally how things work. And so I used an LDA model to identify 100 topics in the Ellis Island oral history collection. So across the 2 series that I'm looking at, what are the topics in here if you had to pick 100? And it gave me these lists of words. So Ellis Island, New York, Statue of Liberty, coming, oral history. The second one, age, spell, born, maiden name, birth date. So this is some kind of procedural language. And from there, so this is what the model output, 5 examples. From there, I interpreted these. I tried to assign labels to them. So I think the first topic is about Ellis Island. I think the second one is some procedural language about biographical information. It's the interviewer asking about, maiden name, spell your name, things like that. And then because I'm interested in understanding which topics are related to immigration as it pertains to Ellis Island, I added another layer of coding, which is I classified topics as either immigration related or other. And I ran both sets through this machine, and it coded all of the interviews, and I looked at the average topic distribution per series. So here's a big chart. Essentially, what you're looking at is the differences in topic distribution between the KEC series, which is, again, immigrant only, and the EI series, which is those more holistic life narrative interviews. So the way you read this is the topics that push more to the right are more prevalent in the KEC series, and the ones that push more to the left are actually, sorry, the other way around. I don't know my left and right. To the left is more prevalent in KEC series. To the right is more prevalent in the Ellis Island series. And the ones that are highlighted in pink or in a deeper color are related to immigration. So what you can see right away is that topics related to immigration are more prevalent in the KEC series. And just if you're not able to see what's on the screen, the topics related to immigration include Ellis Island, the voyage, citizenship, reflection on immigration, going back was a common theme, leaving for America. So at a glance, it seems that there is a difference. But if you look at the totals, there's not as much of a difference as you'd imagine. So the proportion of the interviews that are actually related to immigration, it's 16.3% for the EI series and 23.6% for the KEC series. Like, how do we make sense of these numbers? Well, I looked at the interview guide for the Ellis Island series, which is, again, supposed to, relative to previous series, prioritize the life narrative. If you look at the questions that are related to immigration, they're about 30% of the overall interview guide. So interviewers are going out into the field with a general guide that 30% of the interviews should be about immigration, and they're capturing 16.3%. And the KEC interviews, whose mandates were, mostly to just get sound bites for the museum, are also doing under that. So there is a difference between the two, but it's really not as much as you would imagine. Before I start to unpack what I think about these numbers, I just want to talk a little bit about LDA topic models and why we may like them and what their limitations are. The first benefit is that it's really effective for finding common topics in really large collections and for finding segments that are related to each other. And the thing that I find really fascinating about this is that the topics are endogenous, meaning that all of the topics that arise from the topic model come straight from the interviews. You're not imposing your own kind of ideas about what topics you're looking for. It's just based on what's common. And this can yield some really interesting results. So right now I'm doing some work on the Obama presidency oral history project. It's a large oral history project, and we set out to research specific things. We had research guides for every topic. And now that we're done our field work, we're coming back and we're looking at the interviews with a bunch of tools, including topic models, to understand, okay, we set out to research these things, but when asked, what do people actually want to talk about? Like, how do these stories differ? So I don't know, from an oral historian's perspective, I find that really neat. Another thing that's nice is that there's consistent bias, which sounds like it's actually a bad thing, but if you make a mistake in coding, or there's something strange happening with your model, it's going to grade every interview in the same way. When you're working on any kind of large oral history project and you're doing coding and you're working with more than one person, there will always be intercoder reliability issues that you can try to minimize as much as you can, but they're there. A nice thing is that with an LDA topic model, at least the bias is consistent. Limitations, though. A lot of the things that I've shown you are more of an art than a science, even though they're kind of mathematically fueled. And there's a big risk that you're going to impose meaning on sets of words where there actually isn't any meaning. There's a nice paper, if you're interested in this, called Reading Tea Leaves. And there are basically some procedures you can take to make sure that you're not just kind of reading tea leaves when you're interpreting the results of these models. You basically are engaging other humans. You're inserting words that don't belong in topics and seeing if people can detect them to make sure that your topics are actually sound. Another thing is that LDA topic models require a lot of pre-processing, which I won't detail for this presentation, but it's a process that can remove important context and requires a lot of human judgment that has to be well documented and thoughtful. And even then, you can strip some really important context. Finally, LDA topic models are considered bag of words models. So if you picture your interview, you shake all of the words off the page into a bag. That's how the topic model is understanding your interview. It doesn't know anything about word order. And so all the words are just floating, and you lose some of the really important context that you get just from sentences, which are, I'd argue, very, very important for meaning. Okay, back to our regular programming, though. We see some differences. What's driving these differences? You can feel free to put in the chat what your hypothesis is. I thought just generally about oral history and what we know about interviews and how they're shaped. We know that interview agendas are co-created, that they are ongoing negotiations between the interviewer and the narrator, and that there are a bunch of things that could possibly influence the conversation. Who's interviewing? Maybe that's a big factor. Is the interview duration important? Is gender at play? I mean, when I took a cursory glance at the corpus by gender, I noticed that the interviews with women spoke less about labor. Is that due to questions being asked, or is that due to labor participation at the time? Is country of origin important? Is project design important? There are all these things that kind of hard to parse out. So I just looked at these things one by one, and I checked the composition of these series. So first, I looked at the percent of each interview series that's related to immigration by interviewer. So on the left, we have the Ellis Island series, and two main interviewers, Janet Levine and Paul Segrist, they both kind of hover around 16% of their interviews are about immigration. So it doesn't really matter who's doing the interviews here. They're in the same band. And the Keck series, which has that step up, between the top interviewers as well, they're between 23, 25, 26%. So there's some consistency there. So I wondered, okay, is there some other difference that could be driving this? If you look at country of origin and you look at gender and you look at duration, the only thing that really pops out to me is the durations. So Ellis Island interviews are longer, and intuitively it makes sense to me that you could talk about more things in those interviews. Checking out the countries, there are some slight differences, but nothing really major, nothing that would move the dial almost 10 percentage points. So I put all of these factors into a multiple regression analysis. So what I'm trying to do here is understand, of these factors, which are the ones that influence the interview agenda most. Specifically, which factors are most correlated with the percent of the interview that's related to immigration. And I mean, this is not the most attractive table I could have shown you. But if you look at this table, the items that are boxed in and highlighted in white are the items that were found to be statistically significant in determining that component of the interview agenda. But they're not all significant with the same magnitude. So this column here, coefficients, shows relative to each other which of these factors are actually really important for determining the agenda. And the single most important one was, if the series is Ellis Island, then you'll see a 7% reduction in how much of the interview is related to immigration, no matter who's interviewing, the gender of the interviewer or the interviewee, the country of origin, or even the duration of the interview, which wasn't even found to be statistically significant. And so my reaction to this was, that's not that helpful. It's just basically telling me what I know, which is there's something happening in this series that goes beyond any of these other factors that's changing the interview agenda. So I went back to the drawing board and I looked at what writing we had on how topics are managed in oral history interviews. And in particular, I found this really nice article by Evan McMahon called A Conversation Analytic Approach to Oral History Interviewing, where she talks about topic management. And so the most basic unit in oral history is the question and the answer. But Evan McMahon says there's actually another thing that happens, which is the response. And so the question, a topic is introduced, the answer, the narrator responds or changes topic, and then the interviewer has the opportunity either to extend the topic by continuing to talk about the topic or changing the topic. And she says this is where we actually really see conversation management happening. And so if this is true, what we might be able to observe is that these third turn responses are managed differently in the EI and KEC series. So I needed to take another step, which is take the interviews and break them out into the question and answer segments. And from there, I was able to sequence every single interview. So every single topic, who introduces it, and how the next person responds to it. And here's what I found. First, I looked at introductions. Who's introducing which topics? So this table shows, let's start with this top section. Of all the topics that are introduced, who's doing the most work introducing topics? You see, between the interviewers and the narrators for both EI and KEC, pretty equal balance. So there's pretty equal introduction of both kinds of, or of all kinds of topics. But if you break it down into immigration-related topics, this dynamic tends to, or seems to break down a little bit. So interviewers in both EI and KEC introduce 65% of immigration-related topics versus narrators, which are 40 or 35 to 40%. So there's more heavy lifting happening on the introduction side. But the difference between EI and KEC is actually not very big. It's about 5 percentage points off. So it still isn't really explaining why the KEC interviews are so much more heavily immigration related. So I looked at extensions. And so this is inventory of all the turns of conversation in the corpus. And so on the left side, we have the EI series, and on the right, we have the KEC. If you look at narrators, you look at the number of times they extend the topic, how many times those are related to immigration. For the EI series, 30% of the time, the narrator will choose to extend the topic when it's related to immigration. And really similarly with the KEC series, it's 34% of the time. So it seems when they're left to their own devices in both of these series, the narrators are interested 30% of the time in continuing to talk about the immigration topics that are brought up. In the EI series, there's a similar propensity. So they're around the 30% mark. The interviewers are extending those topics. Now in the KEC series, we see a big increase. So 52% of these extensions, 52% of the time that the interviewer is extending the topic, it's related to immigration. So I don't know, seems like I found something. So there's plenty more writing that I've done on this work, which you can find on oralhistoryworks.org, I believe, if you want to read the full paper. But what I found from this was that project design and mandate actually really matter. So the way that the mandate is operationalized is not fully clear to me because it's not incredibly well documented. But I think there's something to be said about a project whose mandate is to capture quotes for a museum. You see these consultants have a specific task. They have to produce these interviews in a very specific way. And the way that they're actually enacting that is through these third turn responses. Okay, I think this is too many charts and I've lost many of us. So I'm going to bring us back to a different topic, which is curating oral history with NLP. So if you don't have any interest in secondary analysis, that's okay. I think many of us produce work with the intention of bringing it out into the world, having some kind of audience, whether that's just our families or a really broad public. One project that I'm working on now is the Obama presidency oral history. It's the official oral history of the Obama presidency. We've interviewed 470 people. Of course, the people you'd expect, the president and people from the White House and lawmakers, who to expect from a regular oral history project on the presidency. But we've also interviewed a bunch of other people, activists, organizers, people who we call extraordinary people from all walks of life, whose lives intersected with the presidency in some way. People who wrote letters to the president, farmers, school teachers. And this project, with 470 interviews and around 1,100 hours of audio, has all of the challenges of the Ellis Island oral history. It's so rich, so dense, there's so much potential, but right now we're trying to figure out ways of unlocking that potential. So here's a few things that we're doing. The first is we're using NLP to improve navigation and accessibility. So here are Art and Helen Tanderup. They are farmers and activists from the middle of the country. And among the many interesting things they've done, they protested the Keystone XL pipeline using crop art on their property. And they have a very interesting story that we've represented both in video and in a transcript. And we've processed these through something called the Force Aligner. So it's a tool that takes the video and it takes the transcript and it takes the words in the transcript and an understanding of phonetics and it maps the two together. And you can create new products with those. So we've created two things. One is a time-stamped transcript and the other is captions. And so there's a preview of the site up right now with very limited functionality, but a preview of this tool at the very least, which is all of the interviews are navigable using their transcript and vice versa. So you can search, you can use your caption reader, you can use any number of ways to navigate the media, the audio, the video using each other. For the contemporary for the contemporary internet, we've seen things like this, but for oral history to do it at this granularity is something that we really put a lot of work in trying to figure out. We're also using NLP to segment interviews into clips. So these interviews are long, and we have this challenge where half the people in the collection, you might have recognized their name, and half the people are these people with incredible stories who you may have never heard of. And how do we pull out stories so that people find entry points into these interviews and will sit down and actually engage with interviews with people who they otherwise don't know? And so we're working to segment these interviews into clips. So looking at what are people talking about and when does the conversation change? And then also, how are there linkages between things that are people talking about? When narrators talk about the same topics, when they talk about events, when they talk about policies, and they talk about each other, how can we create some linkages there? Now, unfortunately, I can't show you any examples now because we're still in development. But I can show you conceptually what might happen. So let's say I take an Ellis Island oral history interview, and there's a discussion of the Lower East Side, which is a common place in the Ellis Island interviews for immigrants to settle. Why don't we make the Lower East Side a navigation element and use that to connect Clara Rosenberg's transcript to so many different people who lived in the same neighborhood and maybe had similar or very different experiences? How can we put all of these interviews in conversation with each other and organize that around topics? We're also using NLP to experiment with tags. So this is something that I was working on even just minutes before this presentation. So here's a bio about Art and Helen Tanderup. Mind you, all of our work is produced by humans. Our bios are not written by AI. But we can use AI on these bios to experiment with different tags. So Art and Helen Tanderup, maybe you haven't heard of them. What can we categorize them in an archive or on a site that makes them navigable? Using NLP, we can come up with different schematics, apply them, and then actually test them. So today, we were testing a schematic to see if I'm somebody who knows nothing about anybody in this collection, do these tags actually help me find information that I'm interested in or that I might not even know that I'm interested in? So those are just a few different pathways. Okay, so we're going to do a few things. I just want to create an opportunity for us to cover some questions first that may arise immediately out of this work. Then I want to make an opportunity for you all to talk to each other about this work, your reactions, positive, negative, useful, whatever you really want. But I've created some questions to guide in case they're helpful. And then after that breakout session, I want to create an opportunity for you all to maybe interact with the Clara Rosenberg transcript in the playground. So if as a group you think of some questions or some tasks you might want GPT to try on Dr. Rosenberg's transcript, let's try it. So I guess with that, I think we can open it up to questions. I'm sorry if you've been asking things in the chat as I've been speaking. I see some already.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, folks can feel free to raise your hand or to put questions in the chat or send them to me and I can ask them. I saw one, Chris, you can scroll through, but it's a mix of questions, comments. Here's a really concrete one. Mary Ann Hallregal wants to know what's the size of our staff using NLP on this project and what's the cost?
Yeah, okay. So for my Ellis Island work, it was just me. And the cost to do all the work was under $100. So and that all came from the generative metadata exercise. So I did spend more doing experimentation, but the final result was about $100. For the Obama presidency oral history work, I have support from a researcher in France, and we have this amazing design team that's not doing NLP work, but is turning that into user interfaces also in Poland. But the actual NLP tools that we're using so far are free to run on your machine. So really the only cost is expertise. And I would encourage oral historians to reach out to people in their institutions or in their cities that are computer scientists or are working with NLP, because really oral history interviews are kind of like dream documents for this kind of work. They're long enough that you can do experimentation, and they have some really interesting questions that haven't really been asked or answered before. So yeah, on the Obama presidency project, we've had kind of an expanding and shrinking staff depending on the stage of the project. I think now we're down to, I think at Insight, maybe like a handful of people, under 5. I see a question from Madeleine on top of Marianne's, which is a topic analysis is likely useful for early stages, leaves an important role for critical and contextual human analysis. Of course. Yeah, topic modeling is not going to replace close reading. I mean, it can if you wanted to, but you might not end up with a really meaningful analysis. An example I was talking about earlier today is when you're looking at the Ellis Island oral histories, there's the language that immigrants use to describe sleeping and staying at Ellis Island is the same language that they use to describe their apartments: hallway, bedroom, bed, kitchen. And so if you haven't done a close reading of the text, you can't even train a model that will identify those topics appropriately. So yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah. Another question: how can we stop benevolent or malevolent actors from creating fake histories or tampering with existing oral history record to manufacture fictitious histories? What checks and balances can we implement? This is a good question that I don't know that I have the answer to, and maybe somebody in the room, or maybe so many people here, might have some perspectives. But I've seen some tools that are used to detect fictitious narratives. But yeah, I think it's a question that even goes beyond oral history. So I'm curious if anybody else has any thoughts on that. I think, though, something that is nice about having a public-facing version of a project is if information leaks or if information is taken out of context, you have a repository that you can drive to and say, here's the full thing in context. Can you provide a list of tools in addition to the playground that you've been using, both for NLP and LDA? So I want to clarify, LDA is an NLP tool. The tools that I'm using, let me try to type them in. I'm using GPT, I'm using LDA. And I'm using per topic, just these three things right now, but I'll let you know if something else comes to mind. Are there any AI programs that can translate and or transcribe recorded interviews? Yes, there are many. There are some commercial products like Descript, which I like to use. And if you can code, or you know somebody who can code, even at a basic level, I've seen some really good results with something called Whisper, which can run just on your machine. So if you don't want to be paying for usage, I think Whisper's free, and you don't want to be necessarily processing offsite somewhere, I've seen some people have been able to use Whisper on their local machine. What kinds of preliminary data cleaning steps did you have to do in order to work with your transcripts? Okay, so my thesis, which is at oralhistoryworks.org, details all the steps I took. I think it's a lot to be able to describe all of it here, but there are some extra steps for oral history interviews on top of what you normally do to help get the right level of granularity, specifically for topic models. And that includes taking these documents and chunking them into smaller segments. I did a lot of experimentation with that, and hopefully that paper is useful. How might we address this in participant consent forms? Is there a risk their words will be used to train other language models? So it's important to know the policies of the tools you're using. Right now, in the playground, OpenAI doesn't use those inputs as training information. I think for projects that you make public, it's going to be used as training data, whether or not you're using AI to process it, because these models are scraping from absolutely everywhere, from books, from the internet. So maybe something you've said or written is already kind of powering one of these models. Anyway, just to put the risk in context, it is freaky. How successful has it been to use NLP to segment interview clips? Pretty successful. I mean, with the Obama presidency oral history interviews, they're not super highly structured, but the interviews aren't necessarily super spontaneous because the researchers have done so much research coming into the conversation, and they have a good idea of the topics they want to cover, and they've done hundreds of interviews, so they're real pros at managing the conversation. So there are some nice clear breaks where topics change, and we've been able to kind of measure, here's a topic that's been introduced, and then here's some fallout that seems related under a certain threshold. Okay, now there's a new topic. So pretty good success so far. Question about Nobody's Diary. The machine generated a very monotonous voice. Can you add inflection points and adjust the volume? Yeah, you can do all of those things. And the technology from when I produced that in 2022 to now has changed tremendously. And you can do some wild things. And you can do all of those included. You mentioned the importance of getting narrator consent to run their interviews through language models. Have you adapted all your release forms or pre-interview conversations to address this? I know there are more options coming out to limit whether content will feed models outside your work. Something our program is thinking through too. So most of my work has been with the Ellis Island Oral History Project. Those interviews are out there. And so they're not interviews that I've collected. Thinking about consent forms is interesting. I'd like to know what other people think. If it's a matter of information going offsite, are we also using Gmail into the consent forms? I think thinking through how these models work in relation to other technologies that you might already be using in your process is helpful. But if you're saying to your narrator, oh, your interview will not leave my site, I'm the only person who will see it, that might be true. But if you're processing it through a language model, there is the potential for somebody else to see it. So I think thinking through use cases specifically is important. I mean, it hasn't come up for me because I haven't been collecting the works that I'm analyzing. And for the Obama presidency oral history, we're doing at this point local computing, and so it's kind of contained within our research team and our models. Are your transcripts also generated by AI? Can you see a workflow where an interview with all the permissions in place is fed through a learning model to generate the transcript and then tagged? So different things for different projects. For the Obama presidency oral history, we've had a transcript team, manual transcription, copy edit, or an audit edit, another pass, a copy edit. It's such a labor of love. There are so many human hands that have touched these transcripts to get them to a place that reflects the interview. And then it gets sent back to the narrator, and they're able to make sure that the words are true to the conversation and to what they were trying to express. So those transcripts that I've worked on are generated by humans. So I don't know if that, but then we have an API that takes those transcripts, timestamps, and also does a whole host of other NLP related activities, segmenting, adding topics, looking at what things are referenced. And so I guess technically we could make all of that visible to ourselves, but I think for a user experience, we're kind of trying to make that all happen in the background so it feels really seamless to somebody who's actually using it. I wonder if it's ethical to use language models that haven't been trained with the speech of those people we interview. Could language models misrepresent or misinterpret the speech of people that they haven't sampled or being trained with? Yeah, I think if you're using terms in a way that don't kind of match social averages that you would get from the text that the model is trained on, you could definitely see some mismatches. I think with my diary work included, sometimes the language did match, but the topics and the actual content had some mismatch. Are there any AI programs that can translate and or transcribe recorded interviews? So Whisper that I mentioned is, I think, pretty good at handling a lot of different languages. And then translation is not really my area of expertise. We've used actual translators for our interviews, which include Spanish, Arabic, American Sign Language, and that's all been like a human kind of activity. Wikipedia struggles with sourcing knowledge from oral histories. And I don't know if maybe we should go to Breakout soon so we have some time, and maybe the Breakout should be 5 minutes, but I'll try to answer a few more of these quickly. Wikipedia struggles with sourcing knowledge from oral histories. Could AI be used to develop wiki-friendly referencing? Well, that is interesting. Now that you mention it, I don't see a whole ton of Wikipedia articles that are referencing oral history interviews. I think AI can certainly help us enhance our knowledge of the contents of oral history interviews, and maybe that would lead to people kind of adding more of those references. Do you think it's possible to use some of these tools to actually do oral history interviews? So there's a presentation last week, and I think we have a recording of it, right, Amy? That approaches that question exactly. So I recommend that. Can you give us examples of where you had to intervene to correct the machine-generated data / output? The example I provided with describing apartments versus describing Ellis Island is certainly one where I had to reintroduce some context and give the machine a little bit more context on the Great Hall at Ellis Island versus a hallway. So there's one. So maybe we could do 5 minutes in breakout rooms, and then when we come back, maybe we could play a little bit with our transcript and see what's possible or not.
That sounds great. Solby will open up rooms. You're welcome to join if you want to chat a little bit about this with some of the other folks who are here, and then we can come back and give the model some tasks and see how it does.
Perfect. So I'm just gonna open up the rooms now. There should be at least 3 folks to each room, but if you end up alone in a room, feel free to come back to the main room and we'll sort that out. But I'm just going to open up the rooms now.
Hi, everybody. I always like to see the smiling, energetic faces coming back from the breakout rooms. We're eager to hear what went on in your conversations, in particular, if you have tasks you want the model to try in the playground, but also other things that came up. So I'll turn it over to Chris to facilitate.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if I could probably do one or two of these, but if anybody had anything that they wanted GPT to try to do with Dr. Rosenberg's transcript, is there any way you'd like to transform the data or ask questions? You can just throw that in the chat if you'd like.
What if we ask it, what's the most interesting thing in this interview?
Making a value judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Scared. The most interesting in this interview is the story of Dr. Rosenberg's journey from Poland to America as a young child. She describes the challenges of leaving her hometown, the difficult journey by wagon and railroad, the crowded and uncomfortable conditions on the ship, and the experience of arriving at Ellis Island. She also touches on her early days of America, including the language barrier and the struggles of her family during the Great Depression. No, pick one thing. One interesting aspect of the interview is Dr. Rosenberg's account of her mother smuggling tobacco across the border, hiding it in her skirt's hem to avoid detection. This shows the resourcefulness and determination of her mother to provide for their family in difficult circumstances. All right, we have another question, which is okay, so you have top 5 subjects. I think the index may have covered that. Ask about food mentioned. A most emotional moment in the interview. This is interesting too, because there isn't a ton of data about, so it's just basically working with the verbatim. Let me get rid of this. What's the most emotional part of this interview? She's discussing her family's experiences during World War I and her father's decision to flee the Polish army, her mother's struggle to support the family. She talks about tragic deaths and other misfortunes. Yeah, that's heavy. Let's ask about food, lighten the mood a bit. What foods are mentioned in this interview? Nice. Okay, so awesome. So maybe food is an area of interest for you. So in addition to knowing all the basic metadata, it's really helpful to know at a glance what foods are mentioned. Maybe you're actually just studying one specific kind of food and how it's relevant to a specific practice. So, man, I could do this all day, but we should probably.
There's a good one from Erica Jane. Please insert headings and subheadings into the provided transcript to create a structured and easy to navigate document. Include an introduction to the interview as well.
Ooh.
Ooh.
Will it be able to do this without, an example? What do we think?
It's amazing. I mean, I'm sure there's mistakes in there, but
yeah,
wow.
But it's interesting. We learn the components it's picking up every time are a little bit different. Like, I don't know that this interview was in Flushing. How long was she in Flushing for? Just anyway. So it's been probably a year since I've actually read this full transcript, so it's like I'm seeing it for the first time.
Chris,
anyway,
when I played with ChatGPT and asked it questions, if I ask the same question over and over again, it'll give slightly different answers. Would it do that here? Like if you asked it the food question again, would it say exactly the same thing, or would there be variation?
Well, you can control that. So there's this parameter here called temperature, which controls the randomness. The temperature you can turn up or down, and it basically is like how deterministic or how playful is the model. But if you're going to do something more deterministic and you want really steady results, you have to provide it with some examples. So it knows what counts as food. Because, you know, all of these things can be defined in such slippery ways. But I think I'll stop sharing this for now. And I just wanted to maybe for the remaining, I guess we're at time. How did this happen?
Oh, there's a lot to talk about. We're also like, I guess in the remaining like 2 or 3 minutes, it seems from the chat like a lot of other folks are experimenting with these tools in your programs and projects. So if anyone wants to share anything about what they're up to, I think that would be useful for everyone to hear. Or if people have final questions, that's also fine. While you're thinking, I'll just make sure everybody knows that the Oral History Association has a symposium coming up next year on oral history and AI, and they're looking for presentations, proposals, etc. So I'm putting the link for that in the chat. We'll send it out by email too. So if you want to continue the conversation, that'll be a good place to do it. Oh, Linda wants to know what the findings were. Well, yeah, if
I maybe can actually attach it here so you don't have to hear my own butchering. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh.
All right. While you're doing that, Chris, I'll close us out just by saying thank you to Chris for sharing this work. Thank you to the internet for providing us with artificial intelligence to chat with. Thank you to the Brodsky family for supporting the award that helps us to highlight your accomplishments. Thanks to Solby for organizing and running the Zoom today. This is actually our last event in the series as planned so far. That's going to be focused on AI. Our next 2 events are going to be quite different and focused actually on participatory and engaged and place-based ways of doing oral history. So we'll be back together in just about a month. We'll be in person, learning from Danita Mason-Hogans about how SNCC social SNCC organizer veterans have come together to fill gaps in the historical record. So thank you so much to everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.